Once upon a time, in this quaint old Danish town of Odense, there was born an odd-looking boy who was destined to become the world's most famous writer of fairy tales. He was named Hans Christian Andersen, and his humble birthplace at the foot of this street is now one of Denmark's proudest historic shrines. Among the characters that first appealed to his childish imagination were the chimney sweeps, who look very much the same today as they did when Hans Andersen was a little boy. Hans's father was a poor shoemaker with very little practical sense, and his illiterate mother helped to support her impoverished family by washing clothes in the waters of this peaceful stream which flows near the Andersen home. If we could have been here about 150 years ago, we would have seen a poorly dressed peasant woman washing clothes with her sprightly little son helping her or amusing himself in his own peculiar manner. In fact, scenes along the Odense River played an important part in stimulating the fertile imagination of young Hans, who saw in the reflected sunbeams a community of little elfin creatures with whom he had much in common. Hans was an ill-formed, homely, but sensitive boy, and very conscious of his poverty. His early playmates were usually of the fanciful variety, such as snow queens, mermaids, storks, ducks, and swans, all destined to ultimately appear as characters in his immortal fairy tales. He called himself the Ugly Duckling, and his famous story by that title parallels his own life, which was somewhat vindicated when he wrote, "It matters not if one is born in a duck yard, if he is hatched from a swan's egg." The ugly duckling that fought his way through life against the greatest of odds and in the end became a beautiful swan for all the world to admire was Andersen himself. On the very bank where his impoverished mother used to dry the clothes she washed for her high-born neighbors, there now stands a monument to her boy, Hans Christian Andersen, the town's most illustrious son and the patron saint of children the world over. From the day of his birth, on the 2nd of April, 1805, his life was filled with cruel reverses and remarkable achievements. The monument appropriately faces a little plot of land known as the Fairy Garden, and it was here that little Hans is said to have visualized his first fairy tales. Not far from here, a fountain has been erected, which was inspired by a single line from one of Andersen's fantastic stories. "On the wild seahorse you shall ride." The fairy-like castles around Odense also inspired young Andersen considerably. His natural talents as mimic and storyteller made him a welcome guest at these palaces, where in spite of his scarecrow appearance, he was literally adored by the children who listened spellbound to his stories. Here at Glorup Manor, he found sympathetic friends who helped and encouraged him when everything seemed to go wrong. Shortly after the death of her first husband, Hans's mother married again, and the stepfather treated Hans so shamefully that he was forced to leave home. Then began his long years of travel, illustrated today by many items in the Hans Christian Andersen Museum, outstanding among which are his traveling bags, umbrella, cane, high hat, and fire rope. He had a horror of getting caught in a fire, and always carried this rope with him to escape from upper-story windows in case of an emergency. His first real journey from home took him to the little town of Ribe in Jutland. Here he was impressed by the town crier, who still continues the ancient custom of prowling the streets at eventide and shouting the news of the day.
Mr. FitzPatrick has come to Ribe og vil fotografere hele byen og også mig. Hele Danmark skal vises til amerikanerne, så de kan se, hvor smukt det er, og de kan komme over og bruge nogle dollar.
The storks of Ribe also fired Hans's imagination. He referred to them as birds that learned Egyptian from their ancestors in Egypt, where they returned every winter. As he saw the young storks trying their rickety wings for flight, he fancied he was in the same category, and with the help of friends, he embarked on his first journey to Copenhagen. He traveled in an old-fashioned sailing schooner, and we follow him now in a modern ferry boat. In his memoirs, Anderson refers to the seagulls that followed him all the way from his native island of Fyn to the island of Zeeland. And passengers feed them now as he fed their forebears over 130 years ago. Denmark is made up of a series of islands, the most important of which are connected by a remarkably good ferry service. As our ferry boat nears land, its upper bow is lifted to permit a motley assortment of passengers, automobiles, and bicycles to go ashore. Even trains must be transported in ferry boats to consummate their daily service. When Hans Christian Andersen first passed this way, it was by stagecoach. And after leaving the schooner, it took him a day and a night to get to Copenhagen, a distance that we now travel in a few hours. The modern sections of Copenhagen were naturally unknown to young Hans, but in the older districts, there is much that can be associated with his trying experiences in Denmark's capital city. Along this canal, for example, he struggled through many of his early years, and today a simple tablet marks the room which he occupied in this building. Here in poverty and solitude, he wrote many of his most famous fairy tales. But his genius was eventually recognized, and among his benefactors was the King of Denmark, who gave him an audience in his castle and authorized a state grant for his education. He attended school at Elsinore, not far from Kronborg Castle, the setting for Shakespeare's immortal Hamlet, and he writes that he spent many dark hours gazing upon this historic shrine, seeking in vain for a reappearance of Hamlet's ghost. With the passing of time, Hans Christian Andersen's stories began to attract the attention of influential patrons, among whom was the king, who on several occasions entertained the author in this castle at Frederiksborg. Although the ugly Duckling, as he called himself, never married, he had a few romantic love affairs, including one with the Swedish nightingale, Jenny Lind. His unrequited love is best expressed in his story of the little mermaid, who also loved in vain. This famous statue, gracing the harbor of Copenhagen, was erected in honor of Andersen's sorrowful mermaid, who sits here day and night, waiting for a princely lover whom she may never see again. The life of her creator, however, was not entirely without love, for he was endeared to all mankind. He died in the year of 1875, but his immortal fairy tales will live forever in the hearts of millions of men, women, and children throughout the world. And it is with this thought that we say, farewell to Denmark, the land of Hans Christian Andersen.